This is a story of a plantation where whips crack against quivering flesh in the dead of night, and a mistress's bold, insatiable cravings twist pain into perverse ecstasy, staining the soil with blood and secrets forever. Subscribe the channel and like the video. Let's begin the story. Chapter 1. The Arrival of Madame de la Coive. Devil doesn't always announce himself with fire sometimes. He arrives in a carriage upholstered in cream silk, wearing a woman's face, the heat that August bore down on Thornhallow Plantation like a curse made manifest, thick and wet as birth blood. Spanish moss draped from the live oaks in grey-green shrouds, swaying without wind, patient as nooses, waiting for necks. The air itself seemed to hold its breath when the carriage came rattling up the elm-lined drive, its wheels cutting furrows through red clay still, soft from the previous night's rain that had fallen warm as tears and tasted of salt when it touched the tongue. The enslaved people working the near fields heard it first. The percussion of hooves, the creak of expensive wood and metal springs. They straightened from their stooped labor, hands still clutching cotton bowls, and watched with the peculiar stillness of those who have learned that survival often depends on becoming invisible. But even from a distance, they could feel it, a coldness that moved against the suffocating heat. Something wrong approaching in the shape of something beautiful. Madame Céleste Delacroix descended from the carriage, like a vision painted by a madman's hand. Her traveling dress was the color of winter sky, a pale, perfect blue that seemed obscene against the blood-red earth and the dark bodies bent in the fields. Honey-colored ringlets framed a face that belonged in a cathedral, all porcelain delicacy and rosebud mouth. She was 23 years old. She was beautiful the way a blade is beautiful, made for cutting. "My love," Master Thaddeus Delacroix breathed, taking her gloved hand with a reverence he'd never shown his god. He was a florid man gone soft in his 40s, rich from cotton and cruelty, and he looked at his new bride the way a drowning man looks at distant shore with desperate, doomed hope. She smiled at him, and her teeth were very white. "Show me everything," she said, her voice carrying the refined lilt of Charleston's French Quarter. "I want to see what's mine." Behind her, two drivers struggled with a trunk. It was black, lacquered wood bound with brass, and it was heavy, so heavy that both men grunted with the effort of lifting it. When they set it down on the crushed shell drive, it hit the ground with a sound like a coffin lid closing. For just a moment, no longer than a hummingbird's heartbeats, something inside the trunk moved. Something that made a sound not quite like weeping, not quite like laughter. Old Elijah, who'd worked Thornhallow since before Thaddeus's father bought the land, felt ice crystallize in his belly. He was standing near the big house, having just delivered firewood despite the hellish heat because Mistress Adelaide, Thaddeus's mother, insisted on fires year-round to drive out vapors. His eyes met Madame Delacroix's across 30 feet of manicured lawn, and what he saw in her gaze made him remember stories. His grandmother had whispered stories about women in Africa, who wore human skin but housed something else beneath. She'd called them blood drinkers, soul-eaters. Madame Delacroix's smile widened as she held his stare, and Elijah looked down, quick and submissive, but not before he saw her tongue dart out to wet her lips a pink flash. Serpent quick. That first night, the plantation hosted a supper to welcome the new mistress. The dining room blazed with 100 candles, and platters groaned under roasted meats and delicacies shipped from Charleston. The enslaved house servants moved like ghosts between the white guests, pouring wine, clearing plates, their faces carefully empty, But 17-year-old Beulah, who'd been born in the big house and grew up playing at Thaddeus's feet before he understood she was property. She watched the new mistress with the clarity of the young and doomed. Madame Delacroix barely touched her food. Instead, she watched the servants with an intensity that made Beulah's skin prickle. The madame's gaze lingered on backs, on necks, on the places where clothing met flesh. Her breathing had gone shallow, her pupils dilated despite the candlelight. "My dear, you seem distracted," commented Mistress Adelaide. Thaddeus's mother, a vulture of a woman who ruled Thornhallow with Presbyterian certainty. "Forgive me," Celis said, her accent dripping like honey from a hive full of wasps. "I'm simply fascinated by your household management. In Charleston, we kept such tight discipline. Here, I sense a certain ... laxity." The word fell into the room's chatter like a stone into still water. Thaddeus blinked, confused. "Laxity. Mother runs a firm establishment." "Oh, I cast no aspersions on your dear mother's methods," Celis interrupted, placing a delicate hand on his arm. Her fingers were cool even in the stifling heat. "But I have my own philosophy regarding the management of chattel. My father was quite progressive in his techniques. He understood that proper discipline is an art form, to be cultivated with passion and ... precision." The way she said passion made several of the guests shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "I've brought my own implements," she continued, her voice light as birdsong, conversational as discussing embroidery. "In that trunk of mine, they're quite specialized, quite effective. I'm eager to demonstrate their application." Mistress Adelaide's face had gone rigid. "Surely you don't mean to involve yourself in such unseemly matters." "A lady of breeding, a lady of breeding," Celeste cut in, and now her smile had edges. "Understands that a plantation is only as prosperous as its discipline is rigorous. And I assure you, Mother Delacroix, I have made discipline my particular study." The trunk was carried to the mistress's dressing room by 3 men, and even then they stumbled under its weight. When they set it down, the sound it made was like a heartbeat, deep, resonant. Wrong. Beulah was ordered to help the madame undress for bed. Her hands shook as she worked the tiny buttons of the traveling dress, as she unlaced the corset, as she helped her new mistress into a silk nightgown white as bone. "What's your name, girl?" Celeste asked, studying herself in the mirror. "Beulah, ma'am, Beulah." "Pretty name, biblical." She turned, and Beulah found herself trapped by eyes that seemed bottomless in the lamplight. "Tell me, Beulah, has anyone here ever been whipped?" The question fell like an axe. "Yes, ma'am, sometimes, when there's disobedience." "And how do they whip here?" "Quick, brutal, perfunctory." Beulah's mouth had gone dry as cotton. "I don't rightly know, ma'am." Celeste moved closer, and Beulah could smell her perfumed jasmine and something underneath it. Something like copper, like meat left in the sun. "You'll learn," the madame whispered. "You'll all learn. There's whipping that breaks the body, yes, but there's whipping that feeds something else entirely. Whipping that opens doors, that lets things in." She reached out and traced one gloved finger down Beulah's cheek, her neck stopping just above her heart. "I can feel it already," Celeste breathed. "This land, it's hungry. It's been waiting for someone who understands how to feed it properly. Blood and pain and tears. The land remembers these things, holds them like water in a cistern. And when you give enough..." Her hand pressed against Beulah's chest, and the girl gasped because the touch burned cold. The land gives back. There was a sound then, from inside the black lacquered trunk. A scratching, deliberate, 3 times scratch, scratch, scratch. Madame Delacroix's smile bloomed wide and terrible. "Ah," she said, "they're eager, good. Tomorrow we'll begin. I'll need 4 of them to start with. Young ones, strong ones, the ones with spirit." She released Beulah and moved toward the trunk, running her palm across its surface like a lover's caress. It's been so long since they've fed properly. The voyage from Charleston was difficult, so many eyes, so many questions. But here, she looked over her shoulder at Beulah, and in the lamplight, her eyes reflected gold. "Animal bright here, we can do anything." That night, Beulah ran back to the quarters and told them everything. The women gathered in the darkness of Mama Rue's cabin, Mama Rue who knew herbs and roots, who kept the old ways alive despite the master's prohibitions. "She got something wicked with her," Beulah sobbed. "Something in that trunk, something that ain't natural." Mama Rue listened, her face carved from ancient wood, her eyes holding centuries of sorrow and survival. Finally, she spoke. "I seen her kind before. Long time ago, when I was a girl in the Low Country. They called them different names in different tongues, but they all mean the same thing. Hunger wearing human form. She gonna hurt us, children. Gonna hurt us bad. And where's she gonna enjoy it? Gonna drink it down like wine. What do we do?" Someone whispered. Mama Rue was silent for a long time. "Then we survive. We endure. We remember. And we wait for the land to have its say. Because the land always does, eventually. Blood calls to blood. Pain calls to pain. What's she fixing to start here?" The old woman shook her head. "It gonna echo long past her dying. Gonna stain this place forever." In the big house, Madame Celeste Delacroix knelt before her black lacquered trunk. She whispered to it in a language older than French, older than English, older than the cotton growing in the fields. The trunk whispered back, and the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks began to sway, though there was no wind at all, swaying like bodies suspended, like the rope remembering the weight it would soon be asked to bear. 3 days later, the screaming would begin. Chapter 2. The Whipping House. Some buildings are born evil. Others have evil carved into their bones, one scream at a time. The structure stood 200 yards from the main house, hidden behind a curtain of weeping willows and wild honeysuckle that couldn't quite mask the smell. The enslaved called it different names, depending on who was listening. The schoolhouse, when overseers passed by. The correction house in front of Master Thaddeus. But among themselves, in the darkness of their quarters, they called it what it was, the screaming place. It had been built 30 years prior by Thaddeus's father, a Puritan-minded tyrant who believed salvation came through suffering. The building was windowless, its walls thick, cypress meant to muffle sound. Inside there were rings bolted to the walls at varying heights. A wooden post worn smooth by countless bodies pressed against it, and a floor with grooves carved by decades of thrashing feet and flowing blood channels that led to a central drain. Because even cruelty requires practicality, but it had fallen into disuse over the years. Thaddeus preferred swift, public punishments than lashes in the yard. Brutal and efficient, meant to frighten rather than satisfy. The whipping house had stood empty for nearly a decade, home only to spiders and the residue of old agonies that still seemed to cling to the walls like smoke, until Madame Delacroix arrived. On her third day at Thornharlow, she had the building cleaned. She personally supervised as enslaved workers swept out the accumulated filth, oiled the door hinges, and replaced the rotted rope. She walked the perimeter with the focus of an architect, running her gloved hands along the walls, testing the bolted rings with sharp tugs, her face alight with something that made the workers avert their eyes. Perfect, she breathed. Absolutely perfect. The walls are so thick, so private. She had her black lacquered trunk carried inside and placed in the corner. No one was allowed to touch it but her. When it was moved, that same scratching sound came from within, deliberate, rhythmic, like something counting time. The summons came at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon that shimmered with heat. 4 names called. Samuel, 19, field hand with shoulders like an oak and eyes that hadn't yet learned to stay down. Prudence, 16, house servant who'd once dared to spill coffee on Mistress Adelaide. Jonas, 22, who'd been caught teaching himself to read from a discarded Bible. And Beulah, because Madame Delacroix had taken a particular interest in the girl who'd helped her undress that first night. Consider this an education, Celeste announced to the small gathering of overseers she'd invited to watch trusted. Men who understood that what happened in the whipping house served both discipline and other appetites. Discipline without artistry is mere brutality, but discipline elevated to ceremony, that transforms both the punished and the punisher. She'd changed for the occasion. Gone was the delicate lady in blue silk. She wore a simple cotton dress, the color of dried blood, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her honey curls pinned severely back. She looked like a surgeon preparing for an operation, which, in a way, she was. Samuel was first. They stripped him and bound him to the post, arms stretched overhead, his magnificent body on full display. Madame Delacroix circled him slowly, trailing one finger along his spine, feeling him flinch at her touch. "You're beautiful," she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Strong, defiant. I can see it in your eyes, you hate me. Good, hatred makes the blood sing louder." She opened her trunk. The interior was lined with crimson velvet, and nestled within were implements that belonged in no civilized world. Whips of braided leather studded with small metal thorns, thin canes soaked in brine, flails with knotted cords designed to tear rather than merely mark. But she selected something simple for this first session, a standard bullwhip, well worn, the leather dark with old stains. "The first stroke is always the most important," she said conversationally, testing the whip's weight. "It sets the tone. Too hard and they faint too quickly. Too soft and they don't understand the commitment you're making." She struck. The sound was like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Samuel's back opened in a perfect red line, and the scream that tore from his throat wasn't quite human. It was the sound of something breaking that can never be fully repaired. Madame Delacroix shuddered, her breath catching, her eyes rolling back for just a moment. When she refocused, her pupils had dilated to black pools, and a flush had spread across her porcelain throat. "Again," she whispered, and again, and again. By the time she finished with all 4, 3 hours had passed. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky the same red as the floor. Madame Delacroix emerged from the whipping house with her dress speckled in crimson, her hair disheveled, her face radiant with something obscene, a postcoital glow that made the overseers shift uncomfortably and look away. Behind her, the 4 enslaved people were dragged out by their arms, barely conscious, their backs landscapes of torn flesh. they would survive. She was skilled enough to ensure that death would be too quick, too merciful. She needed them to heal so the process could begin again. But something else had changed. The building itself seemed different, no more solid, somehow more present. The air around it had thickened, and if you stood very still and listened very carefully, you could hear it, a sound like breathing, slow and deep, coming from the walls themselves. The whipping house had been fed, and like all living things that taste blood for the first time in years, it wanted more. Madame Delacroix established a routine after that. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, she would walk the path from the big house to the whipping house, always alone, always carrying a small leather bag of implements. She would stay for 2 hours, sometimes 3. No one was allowed near during these sessions, not even the overseers who'd watched that first demonstration. But everyone could hear. The screams carried across the fields, despite those thick cypress walls, warped and distant, like sounds traveling underwater. The enslaved people working the cotton learned to mark time by them. First cry means 3 o'clock. Second cry means she's just getting started. Silence means someone passed out, or worse. And every evening, when Madame Delacroix emerged, she looked younger, refreshed, hungry for supper in a way that seemed connected to, but separate from, the meal being served. Mama Rue watched from the quarters and saw what others couldn't. Shadows gathering round the whipping house, like flies on carrion, growing thicker each day. The land was drinking it all in every drop of blood, every scream, every tear. Drinking and remembering. She feeding something. Mama Rue whispered to those who would listen. Feeding it regular, like you'd feed a pet. And whatever it is, she looked toward the whipping house, where lamplight now glowed behind the door every night, though no one entered after dark. It's getting stronger. Inside the building, the black lacquered trunk sat in its corner, and the scratching had stopped. Whatever had been inside was inside no longer. Now it lived in the walls. Chapter 3. The Conjure Woman's Warning. There are women who can read futures in bone and blood. And there are futures so dark even they wish they couldn't see. Mama Akasua was older than anyone could count, older than Thornharlow itself, some whispered. Her back was bent like a question mark, her hands gnarled as cypress roots. But her eyes held the clarity of still water that reflects everything, hides nothing. She'd been born across the ocean in a place she could no longer name in any language the young ones understood. And she carried Africa in her bones the way others carry scars. She lived at the edge of the quarters in a cabin that leaned slightly westward, as though pulled by some distant gravity. Inside, dried herbs hung from the rafters, hyssop and rue, bloodroot and nightshade. She kept things in jars that rattled when touched, chicken bones and graveyard dirt, scraps of cloth stained with various fluids, locks of hair from the dead and dying. The enslaved came to her for remedies, for love charms, for whispered protections against the lash. But they also feared her, because Mama Akasua saw things that hadn't happened yet, and she never lied about what she saw. 3 weeks after Madame Delacroix's arrival, Mama Akasua cast the bones. She did it on a moonless night when the darkness pressed close and thick. In the dirt floor of her cabin, she drew a circle with graveyard dust and placed 4 white candles at the cardinal points. Then she reached into her worn leather pouch and pulled out the bone-shaken bones. Mostly, but also a few human finger bones she'd collected over decades. Pulled from shallow graves with permission asked from spirits. She whispered the old words. the ones her grandmother had taught her in the hold of a slave ship while others screamed and died around them. The words that predated Christianity, that predated Islam, that came from a time when gods walked visibly among men and demanded blood prices. The bones fell. Mama Akaswa looked at the pattern they made and felt ice crystallize in her ancient heart. She gathered them and threw again, hoping she'd misread. The bones fell the same way, a pattern she'd only seen twice before in her long life, both times preceding massacres. She threw a third time. The bones spelled out hunger, violation, death, but worse than death, continuation. A wound that wouldn't close, a scream that wouldn't end. The next morning, Mama Akoswa did something unprecedented. She went to the big house and requested an audience with the new mistress. The house servants stared at her like she'd lost her mind. No one requested to see Madame Delacroix. You were summoned, or you weren't. To volunteer yourself was to volunteer for the whipping house. But Mama Akaswa was old enough to no longer fear pain, and some warnings must be delivered regardless of cost. They made her wait in the kitchen for 2 hours. Finally, Madame Delacroix appeared. Fresh from her afternoon session, her cheeks flushed. Her dress changed, but a small splash of blood still visible behind her left ear like a misplaced beauty mark. "You're the witch," Celeste said, not unkindly. "I've heard about you. They say you see things." "I see what needs seeing," Mama Akasua replied in a voice like gravel and honey. "And I seen you, mistress. Seen what you're doing. Seen what you're feeding." Celeste's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes, interest, perhaps, or recognition. "Have you now? And what exactly have you seen, old woman?" "Blood cries out," Mama Akasua said, her voice gaining strength. "Flesh has memory. You think you just hurting bodies, but you hurt in something deeper. The land, it got ears, it got a mouth. What you feeding it with all that pain and pleasure mixed together, it gonna want more. Gonna want everything. And one day, it gonna turn on you. Gonna eat you same way you eating them." The kitchen had gone silent. Even the flies seemed to have stopped buzzing. Madame Delacroix studied the old woman for a long moment. Then she laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Is that a threat? It's a prophecy. Blood calls to blood. What you're sowing now, you're gonna reap in suffering. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but the land remembers, and the dead don't forget, and what goes around enough." Celeste's voice cut like a blade. She moved closer, and Mama Akoswa could smell the copper-sweet scent that clung to her like perfume. "You think you're the first to warn me? My own father tried. The priests in Charleston tried. They all said the same thing. Stop, turn back. This path leads to damnation." She leaned in close, her breath cold against Mama Akoswa's weathered cheek. "But I've been damned since I was 14 years old. Since I first discovered what pleasure tastes like when mixed with someone else's pain. And damnation, old woman, damnation is exquisite." She straightened and gestured to the overseers. "Take her tongue. Carefully, I want her alive. She can keep her eyes to see, her ears to hear. But warnings require tongues, and I'll not tolerate any more interruptions to my work." They held Mama Akasua down on the kitchen table, while the plantation's pig butcher came with his tools. The old woman didn't struggle. She only looked at Madame Delacroix with those water-clear eyes and mouthed words in her grandmother's language, a curse so old it had weight, had substance, had teeth. Celeste felt it land on her like a stone. She shuddered, then smiled wider. "Yes, she whispered. Yes, curse me. Add your power to what's already growing here. Feed it with your rage. Make it stronger. The butcher worked quickly. Mama Akasawa's screams were brief. She had more control than most, and when they released her, she stumbled out into the afternoon heat with her mouth full of blood and her curse delivered. She would live another 6 months, tongueless and silent. But her eyes would watch everything, and in those eyes, Madame Delacroix would occasionally catch glimpses of what was coming: fire and iron, rope and rage, and her own face reflected in dark water, screaming without sound, forever and ever. Some warnings echo louder in silence. The land had heard, and the land was patient, and the land was already preparing its response, gathering strength from every drop of blood, every muffled scream, every afternoon session in the whipping house where pleasure and agony married into something that would outlive them all. In her cabin that night, tongueless Mama Akasawa threw the bones one final time. They spelled a single word: soon. Chapter 4. Forbidden desires. In the master's absence, sin wears many masks, but lust dressed in cruelty is the most honest monster of all. Master Thaddeus Delacroix departed for Charleston on the 1st Monday of September, called away by cotton brokers and shipping concerns that demanded his presence for a fortnight. He kissed his bride's porcelain cheek at dawn, oblivious to the way her eyes tracked the departing carriage like a predator watching. Unnecessary obstacles removed from its hunting ground. Finally, Celeste whispered to the humid morning air, "Finally, I can be myself." The plantation had never known a mistress like her. Most white women of breeding kept to their parlors and needlework, occasionally issuing orders through intermediaries, maintaining the delicate fiction that they were too refined for the brutal mechanics of slavery. But Madame Delacroix had been performing for her husband, restraining appetites that now, in his absence, could feast without judgment. She'd noticed Samuel within days of her arrival. 20 years old, born on the plantation, his body sculpted by field labor into something that belonged on a Roman statue. But it was his eyes that fascinated her. They hadn't learned submission. When he looked at her, she saw hatred burning clean and pure, and that hatred made her mouth water. "Bring him to the house," she told the overseer that first afternoon of freedom. "To my private chambers. Tell him it's for specialized service." Samuel understood what the summons meant. He'd heard the stories from those who'd survived her whipping house sessions, had seen Beulah's back still healing in slow, deliberate patterns. He climbed the stairs to the mistress's chambers with the resignation of a man walking to his own. Execution, but execution would have been merciful. Celeste's bedroom was lavish in the way of nightmares, white lace, and gilded mirrors. The bed massive, with 4 posters carved like twisted vines. She stood by the window in a dressing gown of crimson silk, her honey hair loose round her shoulders, and when she turned to face him, Samuel saw something in her expression that was worse than cruelty: hunger. "Close the door," she said softly. "Lock it." His hands shook as he obeyed. "Do you know why you're here, Samuel?" She moved closer, circling him like a buyer examining livestock. But her gaze held nothing commercial. This was intimate, invasive. "It's because you're beautiful. Because you're strong. Because when you look at me, I can see you imagining your hands around my throat." She pressed herself against his back, and he could feel her breath hot on his neck. "I want you to understand something. This isn't about discipline. This isn't about correction. This is about pleasure, mine, and if you survive it, possibly yours. Her hand traced down his chest, lower, and Samuel's body betrayed him with an involuntary response that made her laughter sound like breaking glass. There it is, the truth beneath the hatred. Your body knows what your mind won't admit. Pain and pleasure are lovers, always have been, and I'm going to teach you their marriage. What followed was an education in degradation. She had him strip while she remained clothed, maintaining the power imbalance. She produced implements from her wardrobe: leather straps, silk ropes, a riding crop with a silver handle. But she also touched him with gentleness that was somehow more violating than violence. Her fingers tracing scars and muscle with proprietorial intimacy. "You're mine," she whispered against his skin. "Your master owns your labor, but I own this: your pain, your humiliation, your unwilling arousal. I own the sounds you make when you can't hold them back anymore." She bound him to the bedposts and took her time. The crop kissed his flesh in measured intervals. Strike, caress, strike, caress until his body couldn't distinguish between the two. She touched him with clinical precision, bringing him to the edge of release and then denying it over and over, until he was sobbing with frustration and shame and something darker he had no name for. "Beg me," she commanded, her voice thick with her own arousal. "Beg me to stop, or beg me to continue. I don't care which, I just want to hear you beg." And God help him, he did. Afterward, she sat beside him on the bed, trailing her fingers through the sweat on his back, over the fresh welts she'd painted there. Samuel lay broken and trembling, his mind shattered by the realization that his body had betrayed him completely, that at some point in the ordeal, the pain had transformed into something else, and he'd begged not for mercy, but for more. "You'll come back tomorrow," Celis said, her voice dreamy, satisfied. "And the day after, every afternoon while my husband is away. And you'll tell no one, because who would believe you? Who would believe that you came willingly, that you stayed even when I unbound you, that you—" She leaned close to his ear. "That you liked it." She was right, and they both knew it. The shame of his participation was its own prison, more effective than any chain. For the next 13 days, Samuel climbed those stairs each afternoon at 3 o'clock. The whipping house stood empty during Thaddeus's absence. Celeste had discovered a new laboratory for her experiments, one that allowed for greater intimacy, for the exploration of desires too complex for the crude mechanics of simple beatings. She mapped his body like terrain to be conquered. She found every threshold where pain became pleasure, every place where degradation sparked involuntary desire. She made him complicit in his own violation, forcing choices that weren't really choices. "Do you want the crop or my nails? Do you want me to stop touching you, or do you want more?" And the most damning part, sometimes he chose more. The house servants heard everything through the walls, the crack of leather, the sounds of struggle and submission, the mistress's breathy laughter mixing with Samuel's muffled cries. They heard other things too, whispered endearments more obscene than curses, the unmistakable rhythm of coupling, and worst of all, Samuel's voice breaking as he begged for things that would have been unthinkable weeks before. Beulah wept when she heard it, understanding that Madame Delacroix had discovered something more insidious than simple cruelty. She'd found the place where violation becomes participation, where victims become collaborators in their own destruction. On the 13th day, Samuel emerged from the mistress's chambers and walked straight to the barn. They found him there at dawn, hanging from the rafters. his back a canvas of overlapping scars, and his face frozen in an expression that might have been anguish or ecstasy. No one could say which. Madame Delacroix attended his burial with appropriate solemnity, her face veiled, her dress black as sin. But those who stood close enough saw her smile beneath the lace, saw how her hand drifted unconsciously to her belly as though checking for signs of life, for perhaps savoring the memory of death. When Master Thaddeus returned 2 days later, she greeted him with wifely affection and made no mention of the slave who'd hanged himself in the barn. After all, such things happened on plantations. Property damaged itself sometimes, but that night, alone in her chambers, Celeste opened her black lacquered trunk and placed inside it a coil of rope, the rope that it held Samuel's wrists still stained with his sweat and blood. The trunk seemed to purr as it accepted the offering, and the scratching sound that came from within now had rhythm, like a heartbeat, like something growing. Chapter 5. The uprising whispered in gully, in the black throat of the new moon, where even the stars choked on their own light. The enslaved of Thorn Hollow Plantation tasted freedom's first, bitter drop blood mixed with the soil they had tilled in chains. The night unfurled like a funeral shroud over the fevered earth. The plantation's magnolias standing sentinel with petals drooping like the tears of the damned. Thorn Hollow was a beast of rot and regret, its fields scarred by years of forced labor, its air heavy with the metallic temps of sweat and the faint, acrid whisper of blood long spilled. The enslaved moved like ghosts through the shadows, their bodies etched with the mistress's cruel artistry, whiplashed backs that gleamed under the absent moon, wounds festering like open mouths, screaming silent accusations. In the quarters, huddled beneath palmetto fronds and the watchful eyes of twisted oaks, they gathered not as men and women, but as fragments of a broken whole, piecing together a rebellion forged in the crucible of their suffering. Every lash from the mistress's hand had been a seed planted deep, roots twisting through flesh and soul, and now, in this void of night, those roots burst forth, hungry and unyielding. The air thrummed with the pulse of ancient rhythms, the gullah tongues slithering like serpents through the darkness, binding their resolve into something eternal, something that the white world could neither hear nor halt. Whispers cut through the stillness, soft as the rustle of chains in a dream. Darut wood deep, brooder, one voice murmured, a field hand named Ezekiel, his eyes gleaming with the fire of old gods. We gon dig it up, tear it from dar soil. His words, laced with the cadence of Africa, carried across the waves, wove through the group like a spell, drawing nods from the others, women with breasts scarred from the mistress's perverse games, men whose manhood had been mocked and mutilated in her shadowed chamber. She think we bent, but we sharp like obeah blade, another whispered. A woman called Miriam, her voice a hiss of venom, her fingers tracing the fresh welts on her thigh where the mistress had trailed her whip with a lover's caress, turning pain into her twisted ecstasy. These exchanges, comprising the fragile web of their plan, spoke of rituals passed down from ancestors who walked the middle passage, their ghosts now rising to guide vengeful hands. Blood for blood, under Da New Moon Eye, they breathed in unison. The phrases fragmented and low, a chorus of defiance that shivered the leaves and made the wind itself pause in dread. The foundation of their uprising was built upon layers of agony, each stone a memory of the mistress's depravities. In the daylight hours, under the blistering sun that baked the plantation into a hellish forge, they had endured her visits to the whipping house, that windowless tomb where she emerged flushed and sated, her silk gloves stained with the vulgar fluids of her sadistic pleasure. She took them one by one, her laughter echoing like the cries of harpies, her hands roaming bodies in ways that blurred the line between torment and forbidden desire. Samuel, the defiant one, had been her favorite plaything. His strong form bent over the post as she whispered obscenities, her whip cracking like thunder against his flesh, drawing blood that she licked from the lever with a moan of ecstasy. The violence was intimate, vulgar in its boldness, her fingers probing wounds, her breath hot on their necks as she forced them to beg, to perform acts that shamed both body and spirit. These horrors, comprising the dark undercurrent of their world, fueled the enslaved's resolve, transforming broken spirits into weapons. The quarters reeked of it, the stench of infected lashes mingling with the musk of suppressed rage, a volatile brew that simmered beneath the surface, ready to erupt. As the night deepened, the enslaved circled closer, their movements cinematic in their precision, shadows dancing like specters on the edge of madness. The plantation loomed as a character in its own right, its creaking boards and groaning beams whispering secrets of past uprisings crushed under heel. They invoked the conjure woman's warnings, her bones cast in the moonlight now guiding their hands, as they sharpened makeshift blades from rusted tools and hidden stones. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the very soil breathed with anticipation, the magnolia roots twisting upward like grasping fingers, eager for the feast to come. In this folkloric ritual, they painted their faces with mud and blood, a vulgar mask of war that stripped away the veneer of submission, revealing the raw adult savagery beneath. One man, his back a tapestry of scars from the mistress's whip, recounted in hushed tones how she had forced him to his knees in her chamber, her body pressed against his in a grotesque parody of intimacy, her whispers demanding degradation as she marked him with her teeth. "We gon' make her taste her own poison," he snarled, the words a blade slicing the night, and the group responded with nods, their eyes alight with the promise of retribution. Yet, as the clock of the cosmos ticked toward midnight, a subtle horror seeped in, the kind that clawed at the edges of resolve. Whispers turned to fragmented prayers, "Dar, spirits watch." "But Dar dead don't sleep," one voice faltered, revealing the fear that their plan might summon something worse than the mistress's wrath, perhaps the very curses she had unwittingly unleashed. The violence they planned was not clean. It would be bold, intimate, a mirror of her own excesses, with bodies broken and blood spilled in ways that echoed her perversions. The air thickened with it, a palpable dread that made the trees groan and the ground tremble faintly, as if Thornhallow itself recoiled from the storm brewing within its bowels. And then, as the first faint howl of wind mimicked a scream, the edges they had honed so sharply began to glint and the darker blade raised, a chain uncoiled, ready to cut deep into the night. But in that moment, a figure stirred in the distance, a pale shape. Chapter 6. Blood on the magnolia roots in the ashen breath of dawn, where the new moon's shadow still lingered like a lover's bruise. The master of Thornhallow Plantation beheld his domain reborn as a charnel house of mirrored horrors, every root thirsting for the vengeance it had long cradled in its veins. The air hung thick and fetid, a miasma of iron and decay that clawed at the master's throat as he dismounted his horse, his boots sinking into soil now, slick with the offerings of the night. Thornhallow, once a monument to his dominion, had twisted overnight into a grotesque theatre of retribution, its magnolias drooping like executioners' hoods, their roots exposed and glistening with the fresh blood that fed them. The fields, scarred by years of broken backs and whispered curses, now bore the fruits of rebellion bodies strewn like discarded dolls, their limbs contorted in the final agonies of uprising, eyes staring blankly at a sky that refused to weep. The master's wife, the mistress, dangled from the very chains she had forged in her perverse delight, her form suspended in the courtyard where she had once dispensed her cruelties. Her body, a canvas of poetic justice, was etched with the signatures of every lash, every violation she had authored, whip marks mirroring those on the enslaved. Her skin flayed in patterns that evoked the intimate degradations she inflicted, bloodied gashes where her breasts had been pierced with rusted nails, and lower, the vulgar wounds between her thighs, carved with the same tools she used to shatter others' dignity. Yet death had not claimed her swiftly. No, the conjure woman's magic wove through the air like invisible thorns, binding her spirit to the flesh, ensuring that her education and suffering had only just begun, her eyes wide and unblinking. Trapped in a limbo of eternal torment, whispers slithered through the wreckage, faint as the rustle of winding sheets. "He, see now, Dar Master, see," one voice breathed from the shadows of the quarters, a survivor named Jonas, his hands still stained with the night's work. His kingdom fall like rotten fruit. The enslaved who remained, hidden among the ruins, exchanged these fragmented incantations, their words a chorus of ancestral triumph, laced with the gullah rhythms that had fueled the uprising. "She hanged where she made us hang," another murmured, a woman with eyes like shattered obsidian, her voice cracking like dry bones. But Dar magic hold her tight. These whispers, comprising the undercurrent of their victory, wove through the dawn like a spell, reminding the master that the roots of Thornhallow drank deeper than blood. They feasted on souls, and his wife's eternal agony was merely the first course in a banquet of curses. The plantation pulsed with the aftermath of the revolt, its very foundations groaning under the weight of spilled secrets. In the whipping house, now a shrine of inverted horrors, the air reeked of congealing fluids and the metallic temps of exposed viscera, where the enslaved had turned the mistress's instruments upon her with bold, intimate fury. They had stripped her slowly, as she had done to them, her screams echoing into the void as they pressed heated brands into her flesh, marking her with the same symbols of ownership she had seared into their skin. The violence was vulgar, unrestrained, a mirror of her own excesses. Men who had endured her forced degradations now violated her in kind, their hands rough and unyielding, drawing forth cries that blended pain and perverse echoes of her pleasure. Her body, once a vessel of sadistic delight, now bore the horror details of their retribution, teeth marks ringing her nipples, where she had bitten others in her chambers, deep, ragged tears across her abdomen, as if the magnolia roots themselves had clawed upward to claim her. The conjure woman's magic, invoked in the dead of night, lingered like a fog of spirits, her bones prophecy fulfilled in this tableau of justice, ensuring that the mistress's death was no escape but a gateway to unending lessons, her spirit tethered to the chains, forced to relive each agony inflicted upon her victims. As the master staggered through the carnage, his face a mask of dawning horror, the world-building of Thornhallow unfolded around him like a cursed tapestry. The oaks, their branches twisted into gallows shapes, whispered of the ancestors' return, their leaves rustling with the sounds of long-forgotten drums. He passed the quarters, where the air shimmered with the residue of ritual circles of salt and blood drawn in the dirt, candles guttering with flames that danced like vengeful eyes. His wife's hanging form swayed gently, a cinematic spectacle of retribution, her mouth agape in a silent scream, eyes reflecting the horrors she had authored now turned upon her. The magic coursed through the roots, vines creeping up her legs like serpents, burrowing into her wounds, feeding on her essence, transforming her into something neither alive nor dead, a vessel for the enslaved's enduring rage. In this folkloric nightmare, the master felt the weight of his own complicity. His business trips to Charleston, mere excuses for the cruelties he had ignored, now manifesting as spectral hands brushing his skin, whispers accusing him of the same sins. Yet, as the sun clawed its way above the horizon, casting long shadows that writhed like the damned, a deeper dread uncoiled. The mistress's body began to twitch, not in the throes of life, but in the grip of the conjure woman's curse, her lips moving as if to speak words she had once forbidden. Whispers grew bolder, dar roots drink deep, but they share the feast. Jonas hissed from the dark, his voice a blade against the master's ear. She comin' back, and she bringin' the dark with her. And in that moment, as the master's gaze locked onto his wife's form, her eyes snapping open with a glow that was not of this world, the magnolia roots pulsed with a fresh hunger, blood seeping upward like tears from the earth. Chapter 7. The curse that roots cannot hold, in the crossroads of forgotten oaths and splintered bones, where the earth rejected the dead as eagerly as it devoured the living. The mistress of Thorn Hollow was laid to rest in unconsecrated soil, her essence already slipping its bonds like a serpent shedding poisoned skin. The burial ground, a forsaken patch at the meeting of three roads that twisted like the veins of a dying god, reeked of sulphur and stale magnolia petals, the air thick with the weight of unabsolved sins. Thorn Hollow Plantation, now a skeletal remnant of its former glory, stood as a sentinel of decay, its fields choked with weeds that whispered of the uprising's aftermath, roots snaking upward as if to drag the world into the underworld. They had interred her at midnight, under a sky bruised with storm clouds, her mouth stuffed with salt to silence her screams, her wrists shackled with iron to bind her spirit. Yet even as the dirt piled upon her, the ground trembled, rejecting the offering. The enslaved who survived the revolt, their bodies still marked by her lash, had performed the rite with trembling hands, guided by the conjure woman's lingering spell, circles of ash drawn round the grave, chants in Gullah that invoked barriers between worlds. But some cruelties, vast as the ocean that carried their ancestors' chains, could not be contained by mere earth and metal. They festered like open wounds, seeping into the roots, the air, the very fabric of time. Within a fortnight, as the sun dipped toward 3 o'clock each afternoon, the first hauntings clawed their way back, not with the banal wails of ghosts or the clatter of chains, but with the crisp snap of leather against flesh, echoing from the empty rooms of the whipping house, a sound that curdled blood and summoned memories of her perverse delights, whispers threaded through the shadows, soft as the slither of serpents in the underbrush. Dar salt can't hold what dar roots let loose, one voice murmured, a hidden figure in the quarters. Perhaps Jonas, his eyes wide with dawning terror as he clutched a talisman of bone. She walking, but not like before, worse. The survivors, huddled in the ruins, exchanged these fragmented warnings, their dialogue a tapestry of fear and folklore. passed in the tongue of their forebears to evade the white world's ears. Hear dat whip. It calling us back, another breathed. A woman named Eliza, her voice cracking like dry twigs, her fingers tracing the scars on her arm where the mistress had once trailed her instrument with intimate cruelty. These whispers, comprising the undercurrent of their dread, wove through the plantation like a curse, reminding all that the dead do not forgive, and the echoes of leather striking flesh were not mere sounds, but invitations to a nightmare reborn. The world-building of Thornhollow unfolded in layers of mounting horror, its atmosphere a cinematic shroud that enveloped the living in the mistress's undying legacy. The roads converging at her grave formed a trinity of damnation, paths that led nowhere but deeper into the fog-shrouded woods, where travelers spoke of feeling unseen hands brush their necks, urging them toward the plantation's heart. By day, the sun baked the earth into a brittle crust. But at 3 o'clock, as shadows lengthened like accusing fingers, the air grew viscous, heavy with the phantom scent of blood and perfume, the whipping house stirring to life. Inside, the rooms stood empty yet alive, walls stained with the vulgar remnants of past torment's dried fluids splattered like abstract art, implements of pain hanging as if waiting for hands to wield them. The curse manifested in bold, intimate violence, visions of the mistress's spectral form, her pale dress translucent and bloodied, reenacting her cruelties on invisible victims, the crack of the whip drawing real welts on those who dared enter, skin splitting as if struck by an unseen force, blood welling from wounds that mirrored her own perversions. One man, drawn by the echoes, found himself compelled to kneel in the very spot she had once used for her games, his body betraying him as phantom lashes tore at his flesh, forcing cries of agony that blended with echoes of her laughter, the horror details raw and unrelenting, a vulgar echo of the degradations she had inflicted. As the days blurred into a haze of dread, the plantation became a character in its own unraveling tale, its roots creeping toward the grave, as if to unearth what had been buried. The conjure woman's magic, intended as a seal, now twisted into something malevolent, amplifying the mistress's essence, allowing her to seep through cracks in reality. Whispers grew more insistent. "Da, iron break. And she coming through," Eliza hissed, her words a blade against the silence, as others nodded, their faces etched with the knowledge that the hauntings were evolving. The sounds of leather now accompanied by faint mocking breaths and the rustle of silk. In this folkloric nightmare, the boundaries between life and death blurred, the curse feeding on the living spheres, turning Thornhollow into a vortex of eternal punishment. And as the clock struck 3 on the 14th day, the echoes crescendoed into something tangible, a shadow in the doorway of the whipping house, shaped like her form, whip in hand, but with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. The ground at the crossroads split, roots recoiling as if in pain, revealing a hand pale and bound reaching upward from the grave, the curse refusing to be held, bleeding into the world with a promise of retribution that would ensnare all who remained. Chapter 9. The Descendants' Reckoning. The shadow of October's waning moon. 150 years after the soil of Thornhollow drank its fill of vengeance, a Delacroix heir stepped onto the cursed land, her footsteps echoing like the tolling of a forgotten bell, oblivious to the hunger that had waited, patient as the roots themselves, for blood to return. The plantation, a relic frozen in time's cruel embrace, sprawled across the mist-shrouded earth like a skeletal beast, its ruins weathered by decades of neglect, yet pulsing with the unseen rot of memories. The year was 2025, and the world beyond Thornhallow buzzed with the hum of machines and fleeting lives. But here, the air hung heavy with the stench of damp earth and faded magnolia blooms. The grounds a labyrinth of overgrown paths and crumbling structures that whispered of atrocities long buried. Victoria Delacroix, the unwitting heir, had come driven by a lawyer's letter and a vague inheritance papers speaking of land and legacy. Blind to the horrors etched into the soil, she was a woman of the modern age, her tailored coat and polished boots a stark contrast to the antebellum ghosts that lingered. Yet, as she crossed the threshold, the land stirred, its roots awakening with a thirst undimmed by centuries. Thornhallow remembered what history had scrubbed from books, the uprisings, the lashings, the spectral woman who walked at dusk, her appetite for agonies incomplete, her corruption seeping deeper than any grave could hold. The mistress had waited, her essence woven into the foundation like veins of poison. And now, with Victoria's bloodline calling her forth, the debts inherited in flesh began to stir, the air thickening with a palpable dread that clawed at the senses, turning the twilight into a cinematic shroud where past and present collided in a symphony of screams. Whispers slithered through the underbrush, faint as the breath of the long dead. "She come back, blood of her blood," one voice murmured, perhaps the echo of a slave's spirit or the conjure woman's lingering shade. The words, fragmented and insistent, carried on the wind to Victoria's ears as she wandered the overgrown paths. "The land knows your name. Child, run while you can," another hissed. A spectral warning from the shadows of the whipping house, where hidden figures seemed to shift in the corners of her vision. Among the ruins, these dialogues wove a tapestry of foreboding, the gullah rhythms of old blending with modern echoes. "Payment due." In flesh and bone, a voice breathed near her, close enough to raise the hairs on her neck, reminding her that some curses transcended time, their whispers a chain linking the air to the mistress's unquenched hunger, urging her deeper into the maw. The world-building of Thornhallow unfolded in layers of encroaching terror, its atmosphere a suffocating blend of decayed grandeur and supernatural menace. The plantation's main house, with its sagging porch and shattered windows, loomed like a sentinel of forgotten sins, vines creeping across the walls as if to restrain the horrors within, while the fields stretched out in a sea of waist-high weeds that rustled with unseen movements, the soil itself seeming to pulse underfoot. Victoria, ignorant of her lineage's darkness, explored with a mix of curiosity and unease, her flashlight beam cutting through the dusk to reveal faded portraits in the hall eyes that followed her, mouths twisted in silent accusations. The mistress's corruption had festered here, undimmed by death, her spirit manifesting in subtle ways at first, a chill that seeped into bones, the faint scent of blood and perfume lingering in empty rooms, and the distant crack of a whip at 3 o'clock echoing from the past into the present. As night fell, the land's memory ignited, roots breaking through the earth to form barriers, compelling Victoria toward the whipping house, where the air grew thick with the residue of a gonister, walls still stained with dark fluids, implements of torture hanging as if freshly used. In bold, intimate violence, the horror details emerged. Victoria felt an unseen hand trail her skin, mirroring the mistress's perverse touches, her body reacting against her will as phantom lashes struck her back, drawing thin lines of blood that welled beneath her shirt. the pain blending with a twisted ecstasy that echoed the spectral woman's appetites. She stumbled into a hidden chamber where visions assaulted her images of bodies entwined in vulgar rituals. Flesh pierced and probed as the mistress had once done, the air filled with the metallic temps of blood and the moans of the damned, forcing Victoria to confront the inherited debts in her own flesh, her screams echoing the enslaved Slongo cries as the hours bled into darkness. Thornhollow's cinematic scope expanded, its curse adapting to the modern intruder. The mistress's form materializing in glimpses, a pale figure in the mirror, whip in hand, eyes glowing with undying hunger. The land remembered every lash, every scream, and now demanded payment. Victoria's bloodline, making her the next vessel. Whispers grew more urgent. Your flesh for hers. The cycle turns. A voice snarled in her ear, as shadows coalesced into grasping hands, pulling her toward the abyss. And in that cursed revelation, as Victoria's fingers brushed a rusted chain in the whipping house, the mistress fully emerged from the gloom, her antebellum dress flowing like blood in water, whip raised and dripping with that dark essence. But in her eyes, Victoria saw not just vengeance, but recognition, a mirror of her own face, hinting that the heir's body was the key to the mistress's resurrection. The collection of agonies finally complete in a final, flesh-rending embrace that would bleed into eternity. Asterisk. Chapter the 8th. She walks at dusk in the bruised twilight where shadows clawed at the edges of reality. The pale woman of Thornhollow rose from the root's embrace, her form a harbinger of unending night, drawing the living into the abyss with promises whispered on the wind. The plantation, abandoned and forsaken, festered under the weight of years unspooling like unraveling sinew. Its once grand facade now a skeletal ruin where vines twisted like the fingers of the damned, creeping over splintered beams and blood-stained earth. The slaves who had wrought vengeance had fled northward, their exodus a desperate flight into the cold unknown, leaving behind only echoes of their chains and the faint, acrid scent of freedom tainted by the corruption they could not escape. Thornhollow stood as a monument to decay, its foundations soaked with the seepage of the mistress's essence, a viscous fluid that bled from the soil like the lifeblood of the earth itself, staining the air with a metallic temps mingled with the rot of magnolias. Dusk transformed the landscape into a cinematic nightmare, the sun's dying rays casting elongated shadows that writhed like serpents, illuminating the ruins where travelers lost souls drawn by inexplicable urges. Reported sightings of her, a pale woman in tattered antebellum dress, her skin luminous as moonlit bone, drifting through the overgrowth with unearthly grace. A whip coiled in her grasp that dripped not blood, but something darker, thicker, a substance that shimmered like oil and reeked of forgotten agonies. This corruption, vast and insatiable, seeped into every crevice, turning the whipping house into a maw of eternal hunger, where the air grew thick and cloying, compelling those who crossed her path to follow. Their wills shattered like glass under her gaze, leading them into shadows from which no return was possible. Whispers slithered through the dusk like venomous fog, carried on the breath of wayward wanderers. She come at the Fallon light, pale as death's kiss. One voice murmured, a trapper named Silas who had barely escaped the plantation's pull. His words fragmented and halting, shared in the flickering firelight of a distant camp. Her whip, it whispers back, calling like a lover's moan, among the locals. Rumors spread in hushed tones, their dialogue a web of folklore and fear. don't meet her eyes, or she drag you down, another breathed. A woman with scars from a fleeting encounter, her voice trembling as she recalled the compulsion that had nearly ensnared her. These whispers, comprising the undercurrent of terror, wove through the night like a curse, warning of the mistress's spectral return. Her presence a siren call that echoed the Gullah incantations of old, binding the living to her will in fragments of sound that chilled the blood and stirred the roots beneath. The world-building of Thornhallow unfolded in layers of encroaching dread, its atmosphere a suffocating embrace that enveloped the unwary in the mistress's lingering perversions. As dusk bled across the sky, the ruins came alive with subtle horrors, the magnolia's petals curling inward like clenched fists, their trunks groaning as if remembering the blood they had drunk, and the roads leading to the plantation twisting unnaturally, guiding travelers deeper into the mire. She walked with deliberate purpose, her antebellum dress now frayed and stained with the same dark fluid that dripped from her whip, billowing like the wings of a moth drawn to flame. Her footsteps, silent yet resonant, each one echoing the crack of leather against flesh from chapters past. The corruption manifested in bold, intimate violence. Those who met her gaze described a compulsion that burned like fire in the veins, forcing them to relive her own depravities, their bodies betraying them as phantom lashes tore at skin, drawing real blood in vulgar patterns that mirrored the scars she had once inflicted. One traveler, a man named Elias, seeking shelter in the ruins, found himself ensnared, his vision blurring as she approached, her whip uncoiling with a snap that split the air, the dark substance splattering his face like warm tar, seeping into his pores and igniting visions of the whipping house's horrors, bodies contorted in ecstasy and agony, flesh pierced and probed in ways that blurred pain and desire. The mistress's spectral form forcing him to his knees, her cold hands roaming his body as she had done to her victims, the whip striking with precision, leaving welts that wept and burned, a raw tableau of adult savagery that consumed him whole. These horror details, sparse yet searing, painted the dusk in strokes of unrelenting terror, turning the plantation into a labyrinth of the soul's undoing. As night deepened, the cinematic scope of Thornhallow's curse expanded, its roots reaching beyond the physical realm, drawing in the lost and the curious with an invisible tether. The whipping house, now a hollowed husk at the heart of the ruins, pulsed with an otherworldly glow, its walls whispering the names of those who had vanished within, their screams echoing faintly as eternal echoes. The mistress's corruption fed on the living, her form growing more substantial with each victim, the dark fluid from her whip a conduit of her essence, binding souls to the soil in a cycle of vengeance. Whispers grew more insistent, she took in them for her court. Building an army in the dark, Silas hissed, his voice a blade against the silence, as others felt the pull in their dreams, the compulsion to return and submit. And in the final throes of dusk, as the pale woman paused at the whipping house threshold, her whip raised and dripping, a traveller's figure stumbled into view, eyes locked on hers in fatal mesmerism, vanishing into the shadows with a muffled cry. But in that cursed image, as the roots beneath the earth stirred with fresh hunger, a new silhouette emerged from the gloom, another form, pale and beckoning, hinting that her corruption had begun to spawn echoes, multiplying the horror that would bleed into the dawn. Chapter 10. The plantation that feeds in the veil-thin haze, where maps dissolve into lies and roads twist into oblivion. Thornhallow Plantation endures, a hungering spectre that draws the lost like moths to a flame forged in the abyss, feeding on their essence to sustain its eternal cruelties. The land, untouched by the passage of years, sprawls like a forgotten wound across the earth, its boundaries shifting with the whims of fog and memory, hidden from prying eyes, yet always present for those who wander too far from the light. No chart or compass reveals its location, for Thornhallow exists in the liminal spaces between breaths, between heartbeats where the air thickens with the scent of magnolias rotting in summer's oppressive heat, a cloying perfume that mingles decay and desire, luring travelers with an invisible thread woven from the threads of ancestral screams. The plantation's ruins, cloaked in vines that pulse like veins, stand as a cinematic monument to undying malice, its foundations drinking deeply from the soil's dark nectar, fed by the blood of centuries. Here, cruelty never dies. It merely changes hands, passing from the mistress's spectral grasp to the unwitting souls who cross its threshold, their stories absorbed into the ever-growing tapestry of agony. The house's heart, a room without windows, deep within the crumbling structure, remains the epicenter, lightless void where time folds upon itself. And at 3 o'clock each afternoon, the echoes of leather against flesh resume, teaching lessons that warp flesh and spirit, ensuring the cycle endures forever and ever. Amen. World-building layers unfold in this forsaken realm, with magnolias drooping like executioners' cowls, their roots snaking upward to caress the unwary, and the whipping house looming as a character of its own, its walls whispering tales of Victoria Delacrosse and those before her, their forms now part of the corruption, their eyes staring from the shadows as the plantation feeds, drawing sustenance from the fear and flesh of the new arrivals. Whispers coil through the mist, soft as the slither of serpents in the undergrowth. Come closer, child, the roots call your name, one voice murmurs, perhaps the echo of a long-fled slave or the mistress herself. The words fragmented and inviting, carried on the wind to ensnare the lost. It feeds, and we feed with it blood for blood. Forever another breathes, a spectral chorus from the unseen multitude, their dialogue a web of folklore and warning, blending gullah rhythms with the moans of the damned. In the darkness, these whispers grow insistent. She waits at 3, with lessons that scar the soul, hissing near the ears of wanderers, compelling them forward, their fragmented pleas a chain linking the past to the present, reminding all that escape is but an illusion in Thornhallow's grasp. The atmosphere builds in suffocating waves. The plantation's world, a labyrinth of decaying splendor, where the air tastes of iron and wilted flowers, each step sinking into soil that clings like greedy hands. Thornhallow feeds, not on mere flesh, but on the essence of the lost traveller's heirs, the curious who find themselves drawn by that rotting magnolia scent, their minds clouded until they stumble upon the hidden paths that lead inexorably to the house. Inside the room without windows pulses with an otherworldly rhythm, its walls etched with the vulgar signatures of endless torments, stains of dark fluids that glisten like oil, chains dangling from hooks where bodies once writhed, and the faint outline of figures trapped in eternal agony. The horror details emerge in bold, intimate strokes as the appointed hour nears victims compelled to kneel, their skin splitting under phantom lashes that draw real blood, mirroring the mistress's perverse rituals, her spectral form materializing to trail cold fingers across exposed flesh, probing wounds with a lover's touch turned monstrous, forcing cries that blend pain and unwanted ecstasy. One wanderer, a modern soul named Elias, finds himself in his body betraying him as the unseen force recreates the degradations of old. Whips cracking against his back in vulgar patterns that leave weeping gashes. His screams echoing victorious fate, absorbed into the plantation's hunger. His essence becoming part of the feast, as dusk bleeds into eternal night. The cinematic scope of Thornhallow widens, its corruption spreading like roots through the world beyond, drawing in the lost with promises of secrets and release. The mistress, or what wears her face, teaches her lessons without pause, a blurred figure in the windowless room, whip in hand, her eyes reflecting the agonies of all who came before. From the enslaved to the heirs, their stories intertwined in an unending loop. The plantation feeds, growing stronger with each victim, its mysteries deepening as the air shimmers with spectral forms, hinting at new hands taking up the cruelty, new faces donning the lady's mask, and in the final enigmatic embrace, as the clock strikes 3 and the whip cracks once more in the room without windows, a new traveller steps into the threshold, drawn by the scent, their face obscured in shadow. But in that cursed image, as the roots stir and the whispers fade into silence, Thornhallow reveals its greatest mystery. The cycle does not end. For the plantation is not merely a place, it is a hunger that lives in the blood of the world, waiting, watching, forever feeding, and perhaps, in the quiet of your own dusk, you might catch its scent on the wind. Amen.